Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get any updates to our forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we have out for the state. You can also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391, getting the updates to the forecast through that means as well. Starting off, we'll take a quick look at satellite as we don't have any watches, warnings, or advisories out right now for the state. So we'll take a quick look here. We do have a system coming in from the south as you can start to see it making its way towards the western Aleutian Islands. That will play a factor not so much for today, but as we move into later in the week. And then out over the parts of the Bering Sea, we have a lot of showery activity out there. Some snow showers are moving through the area. As we jump back, we can look out over the mainland part of the state. Again, some isolated showers through much of the area with a broader area of low pressure. We are expecting some instability there and those showers to continue. And then as we look down further to the southeast, we have a couple areas of weak low pressure that have been pushing into the Panhandle area, bringing some precipitation to the area. As we look now at our weather for the remainder of the day, one of those low pressure systems bringing up some of that warmer air, starting to see some of that rain make it into the inside waters of the Panhandle area. Some of the higher elevations still seeing some snow, and areas further to the north seeing snow, staying a little bit colder up there. All along the North Gulf Coast, we're going to see primarily snow for inland locations, but as we get closer towards the water, starting to mix with rain with that warmer air coming in. Through the rest of south central Alaska out over Copper River Basin, we're going to see some snow showers lingering up into the central and eastern parts of the interior as well. Then up along the Arctic coastline, more low pressure there for the central and western portions of the Arctic coast. We are going to see some snow, and then down from the Seward Peninsula through the YK Delta area, seeing some snow showers there from weak low pressure off the coastline, and then some areas of fog lingering for the Kuskokwim Delta area down into Bristol Bay as well. High pressure out over much of the Bering Sea and Aleutians, some lower level light snow showers continuing, and just starting to see one system come in from the west and another system starting to push up from the south. As we step forward, we'll see both of those systems moving closer and starting to bring some snow with the more western one to the western Aleutian Islands. High pressure starting to push off further to the east, still some lighter snow showers underneath that high pressure. Out over mainland part of the state, our one low moving over the Seward Peninsula area, having snow spreading to much of the western part of the interior and the west coast of the state. Arctic coastline covered as well. And then another weak low out over the eastern portions of the interior, bringing some snow showers to those locations. Are expecting some fog to develop over the northern parts of Cook Inlet area, and then snow for locations in south central further to the east, all the way along the North Gulf coastline down into southeast Alaska. We are expecting a mix of rain and snow for much of southeast, with the areas at higher elevation, and for areas further to the north expecting to say snow, but mixing to rain as we get closer to the water and the inside waters, and especially as we get closer towards the Gulf of Alaska. That second system we can now see really starting to come in, pushing towards the southeastern part of the state. Moving into Wednesday, getting even closer, still starting to really bring in that push of warmer air, changing over much of the precipitation to rain for southern locations of the Panhandle. The area is getting more and more towards snow as we get further to the north and at higher elevations. Out over mainland Alaska, weak high pressure out over the interior part of the state. Still some areas of snow showers underneath the high pressure, to include further south by the Prince William Sound area. Up along the Arctic coastline, seeing some snow showers up there as well, extending out west towards the west coast of the state. Lighter showers as we get down towards the Kilbuck Mountains area, and then high pressure out over the eastern portions of the Bering Sea. Our other system pushing in towards the western Aleutian Islands, starting to spread snow out into the central Aleutians as well. As we move into Thursday, that front starting to really make it into the areas, bringing some stronger winds and a mix of precipitation as we're getting some of that warmer air pushing in, starting to transition that snow over to rain as well. High pressure down the west coast of the state, keeping the area pretty void of precipitation, with some areas of snow showers developing as we push further east into the area and then dropping down. South central should stay pretty clear, but with our other system pushing into the northern part of the Gulf coastline, we are expecting some snow showers to continue further to the east from that Cordova area to the east down into south central Alaska or southeast Alaska, where we do have that push of warmer air bringing a lot of rain to southern and areas along the Gulf coastline. Taking us to our temperatures, lows for Wednesday morning staying pretty warm for southeastern part of the state, dropping to just above freezing for the most part, getting colder as we move to the north and to the west, getting into south central Alaska, staying above freezing or above zero for the most part, with the exception of Glen Allen only going down to -3. Negative teens for much of the interior part of the state and single digits for much of the Arctic coastline, a little bit colder as we get further to the east. Down the west coast of the state, single digits for the most part, getting up into the 20s as we get into the Alaska Peninsula and around 30 degrees for the Aleutians. Then on a Wednesday afternoon, getting up into the mid to upper 30s for the Aleutian Islands, into the teens for some of the areas around Bristol Bay. Colder as we get further to the north, some single digit areas as we get especially into the Seward Peninsula area. Out by Gamble, only getting up to 4 degrees for Wednesday afternoon. Some areas along the Arctic coastline, like Ukqiavik, getting up to right around 0, but for the most part staying in the negative single digits for afternoon highs on Wednesday. Into the interior part of the state and staying in those negative teen numbers for the most part, a little bit warmer as we get further off to the west. And then as we drop down into south central Alaska, getting into the teens for many locations around Cook Inlet, a little bit warmer for Prince William Sound area, into the 20s there, and then down in the Panhandle area, getting up into the 40s for those southern locations. Thursday morning, staying in the 30s for those lows for the Panhandle, getting down to below 0 temperatures for much of south central, into the -20s for much of the interior, and -teens along the Arctic coastline. Down the west coast of the state, single digits in the negative areas down to Bristol Bay, and then into the 30s for the Aleutian Islands. For the afternoon highs, we're getting into the 40s for the Aleutians, getting into right around 0 for much of the west coast, and into the -teens up along the Arctic coastline, down into south central Alaska, into those single digits, and into the 40s for the Panhandle.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to aviation weather, let's take a look at the flying weather conditions for Wednesday morning. Scattered areas of marginal and IFR conditions over the west. Isolated areas of marginal in the interior and through much of the south central, just south of Alaska Range. Again, for southeast, looking at a little bit of an area of marginal conditions through the central and northern Panhandle with isolated areas of IFR conditions. For Wednesday afternoon, again, with weak troughs moving through the interior and the west, looking at isolated areas of marginal and IFR conditions. With the system moving into the Aleutians, deteriorating conditions out that way. And then for southeast, again, very isolated areas of marginal to IFR conditions that way. That changes on Thursday morning with low pressure system moving into the area, IFR conditions over much of the southeast, and that spreads through the Panhandle and into south central. And for much of the interior, marginal conditions in this way out through the Yukon and out through the Seward Peninsula and along the North Gulf Coast, and then down through the Aleutians and portions, just hitting portions of the Alaska Peninsula on Thursday morning. Thursday afternoon, again, the system spreads further east with marginal conditions spreading into the Alaska Peninsula. Scattered areas along the Alaska Range and up through the Kuskokwim River system, and then out along the north slope with marginal and IFR areas up that way. And again, that system moving into the southeast, bringing IFR conditions in that area. For past conditions, starting with the Brooks Range passes, Anaktuvik VFR conditions, marginal VFR on the north entrance up that way. And then very much the same for Atigan with VFR conditions, mainly with on the north side moving into marginal conditions. For many of the Alaska Range passes, Lake Clark and Merrill, VFR conditions there with marginal conditions on the as you move into the interior. Rainy, marginal early, and then VFR conditions early, and then changing to marginal later in the day. Windy Pass, marginal VFR conditions there. Isabel, marginal. Mentasta, we're going to go with VFR conditions a little bit farther to the east on the Alaska Range. And Tenita, we're going to be looking at marginal, switching over to VFR conditions, and then for Portage, mainly marginal VFR conditions that way. And then for the southeast passes, Chilkoot and White, we're going to be looking at marginal conditions with IFR conditions changing during the day there. For freezing levels, looking at freezing levels down along the southeast, elevated levels there up to 2,000 feet. Surface conditions move across the coast down through eastern Kenai Peninsula, Kodiak Island, and then down through the western part of the Alaska Peninsula and out into the Bering Sea. For icing conditions, we're going to be looking at below 6,000 feet out there in the Aleutians with isolated areas of considerable moderate, and then out in the interior, mainly below 4,000 feet with considerable moderate up along the Alaska Range. And out into the southeast, we'll look between 3,000 and 8,000 feet as that system moves into the southeast. For the jet stream, strong jet coming out from Japan across the Pacific with 170 knot winds there. As it approaches the west coast, 100 knot winds there. Ridge across the Alaska Peninsula, 75 to 70 knots there. And into the interior, 70 knots analyzed this morning. And with 9,000 foot winds on Wednesday, looking at generally very light winds across the mainland with 5 to 10 knots mainly there. Ridge over the Aleutians or eastern Aleutians and peninsula with 10 to 15 knots in that area. And then across the southeast, southerly winds with 15 to 25 knots there. And for 3,000 foot, again, high pressure ridge out in the Bering, very light winds across much of the mainland. For turbulence, below 2,000 feet will be expected for Wednesday out there on the Aleutians.
Some places on the surface, you might have these steep cracks and giant fissures that you would have to be careful not to fall into. In other places, you might see towers of ice right next to places that were relatively smooth. You might see places that were dark. Ice there takes the form of rock. It's frozen solid until you dig down into that ocean. So you may see some things that look similar to Earth, but you may see some things that are very different.
That voice you just heard?
I am Morgan Kramer, NASA scientist.
I love it.
That's Morgan. She's probably one of NASA's best spokespeople for exploring our solar system's icy moons.
Europa is a fascinating place. It has this liquid water ocean that's about 3 times the volume of all of Earth's oceans combined. That's a lot of water.
To understand what makes Earth so special, sometimes you need to back up and take in the big picture. Remember, the cryosphere is every place on Earth with frozen water. And water is one of the biggest indicators for life.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it.
And so far, Earth is the only planet we know of with life. Although Europa isn't the only icy moon in our solar system, NASA has identified it as one of those places with key astrobiological potential. Morgan is a collaborator on the Mapping Imaging Spectrometer for Europa, an instrument selected for NASA's next mission to Jupiter's icy moon Europa. But she's also more than just a scientist working in a laboratory. She's preparing future NASA missions for success on the surface of alien worlds. This year, Morgan and her colleagues were in the field studying how life colonizes in fresh lava.
Earth, it turns out, has a lot of excellent, what we call analog environments, places that are similar enough to some of these other worlds, that we can conduct some tests and we can do some analyses here. Now, they're not perfect, of course. They're not going to be exactly like Europa, but we can still learn a lot by testing in these environments. Some of these places include Antarctica and the Arctic Circle, but there are other places too, Alaska, Greenland, even Iceland. Any place where you have a lot of ice, because guess what the surface of Europa is made of? A lot of ice.
Studying the cryosphere doesn't just have big implications for Earth. It also matters for the frozen worlds in our own cosmic backyard.
If we're able to find life or evidence of past life on a place like Europa, that tells us that not only can life happen in other places, but it's common enough that it happened at least twice in the same tiny solar system. That means that the universe is wide open in terms of how much life we might find, the types of life we might find. It would revolutionize how we see ourselves and the possibilities for contact in the universe. It would be amazing. Oh, it's so exciting.
As it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. So it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving. My interest in glaciers comes from the sheer size of these things and how much they're able to change on human timescales. And so the amount of mass and energy being transferred by glaciers around the globe is tremendous. It's an absolutely fascinating thing to study from space.
Mountain glaciers are some of the most charismatic parts of the cryosphere. Some might cling to the edges of cliffs at higher elevations, then lay bare and flat in a broad plain, looking cracked and weathered like elephant skin, before tumbling thousands of feet toward the sea and terminating in a dramatic calving front. They're like motion frozen in time, until they aren't. They tell a story about the distant past and yet are incredibly responsive to the present. You can understand why they'd be captivating to all of us, and especially cryospheric scientists. Meet Alex Gardner, a cryospheric scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who is going to help break down what a classic West Coast North American glacier might look like, where high amounts of snow dump onto the mountains.
And at higher elevations, there's melt in summer, but not enough melt to get rid of all of that snow. And so that snow accumulates, it compacts, it turns into ice, and it starts to flow under its own weight, and it flows down the valleys. And as it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. And so it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out and down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving.
Alex uses satellite data to study large-scale changes in glacial ice. But 2,000 miles to the north, Chris Larson from the University of Alaska Fairbanks spends a lot of time studying glaciers from the air. He's been flying over Alaskan mountain glaciers for many years, most recently on a NASA-funded mission called Operation Icebridge Alaska. He's absolutely enamored with his local rivers of ice.
And what do you love about mountain glaciers?
Well, they're in mountains, so they're really pretty.
You couldn't ask for a better way to experience Alaska on a large scale than to go flying around for campaign after campaign and look at all of the mountains in Alaska. Truly infinite. You just feel like you'll never see the end of them, and don't want to either.
But Chris doesn't spend weeks away from home and family for the views. Chris and his colleagues at NASA want to answer some pretty big questions by learning more about Alaskan glaciers and how they tick.
You know, why does NASA care about these? Well, they actually disproportionately contribute a large amount to sea level rise.
In the long run, as the Earth warms due to climate change, the big ice sheets and mighty outlet glaciers of Greenland and Antarctica stand to contribute the most to sea level rise, simply because the vast majority of the planet's ice is stored there. But currently, it's the world's smaller mountain glaciers in comparatively warmer places, like Alaska and Patagonia, that are contributing about a third of all inputs to sea level rise, even though they account for only 1% of the world's ice.
Mostly due to them being dynamic. They have water at the bed, which allows them to slide fast, and they react quickly to climate change and have higher velocities than their polar counterparts.
Back at JPL, AKwx uses satellite measurements of global ice and computer models to predict ultimately how much sea level rise we might see due to climate change. But in the case of mountain glaciers, we also care about the local impacts of disappearing ice.
When we think of changes in ice sheets, we typically think of just what is the consequence for sea level rise and the future evolution of the ice sheets. But glaciers in other regions, like high mountain Asia, Alaska, the European Alps, these are places where changes in runoff matters to stream flows. In places like high mountain Asia, you have a lot of glaciers that feed the streams that flow down to populated regions. And that runoff becomes significant for water resources, irrigation, and agriculture.
Both Alex and Chris are passionate about understanding how glaciers are changing and what it means for our planet's future. They'll continue to use tools like elevation maps from the ICESat-2 satellite and detailed airborne measurements to monitor changing ice.
By the end of the tunnel, you're about 100 feet underground, and you're surrounded by bones sticking out of the wall from the steppe bison and the mastodons. There's sticks that are 40,000 years old. There's grass that's still green, that's tens of thousands of years old.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back to Marine Weather. Let's take a look at the sea ice analysis this morning. You can see the pack ice is slowly encroaching further south. We expect that to continue here over the next couple days, slowly closing in St. Matthew Island. We also had some pretty good ice conditions in Cook Inlet with lower concentrations in the central and southern part of that region. Also some shore ice showing up there in the southern part of that area. Wednesday's marine forecast for southeast looks like southeasterly winds over much of the southern and central inside waters with 15 to 20 knots over the Lynn Canal, northerly at 10 knots. Otherwise, out along the Gulf, we're going to be looking at winds with small craft advisories out there, generally from the southerly direction with 25 knots, seas as high as 9 feet. Over the northern Gulf, winds generally from the east at 10 to 15. For Thursday, southeast, looking at, again, small craft advisories likely for the Lynn Canal area with northerly winds 25 knots. Also watch out for those gusty winds over the Clarence Strait with gusts there at 35 knots. Otherwise, sustained winds out of the southeast 20. Out along the Gulf, winds generally from the south, 25 to 30. Small craft advisories there with seas as high as 13 feet. Along the North Gulf, generally from the north or east at 15 to 20 knots. For Wednesday, we're looking for across southeast, generally northerly winds over Prince William Sound, northeast Gulf, and Cook Inlet, generally winds overall 10 to 25 knots across much of this area. As you get closer to the Barren Islands, winds generally from the northwest at 25 knots. That area picks up on Thursday with seas as high as 11 feet with gales there over the Barren Islands area, Kamishak Bay. Otherwise, across much of the rest of the area, generally northerly winds at 20 to 15 knots. Out along the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, looking at winds generally from the north at 25 knots, and on the south side of the peninsula, northeasterly at 25 knots. On the north side, again, northeasterly at 15. and into Bristol Bay area, northwesterly at 15. And for Thursday, looking at generally northerly winds across much of the Kodiak Island area, Shelkoff Strait, 30 knots, 35 knots here, but otherwise across the Alaska Peninsula, winds generally from the northeast at 25 knots, with Bristol Bay generally from the north at 15. For the Aleutians, generally winds from the east at 35 to 40 knots over much of the area. A little bit lesser winds as you move closer to the eastern side of the Aleutians with 20 to 25 knots. But on Thursday, much higher winds generally from the east as a front approaches, 35 to 45 knots as you get to the central and western Aleutians. Seas as high as 30 feet there in the central Aleutians near Atka and Adak. And for the west coast, looking at winds generally from the southeast at 10 knots near St. Matthew Island, northwesterly at 15, but otherwise along pack ice, winds generally from the south or west at 15 knots. And for Thursday, winds generally from a northerly direction, 15 to 20 knots along the pack ice, 25 to 30 out on the other side of the ice edge. For the Arctic coast, winds generally from the south over Beaufort Sea, winds generally 10 to 15 knots out along the Bering Strait and across the northwest. And for Thursday, winds generally across from the west across the Arctic coast there, and down across the Bering Strait, winds generally from 10 to 20 knots from the west. For tonight's weather, looking at scattered snow showers across much of the mainland, a weak trough moving through southeast with mixed precipitation. We're going to have a front moving into southeast. We're also going to have a front approaching the Aleutians. But again, that front approaches the Aleutians here with mixed precipitation, pretty good winds out ahead of that system. Scattered snow showers across the mainland, and in southeast, again, with that frontal system moving in, mixed precipitation in that area.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.